Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening from wherever in the world you may be joining us. My name is Jeroen de Wolf. I am the director of the UC Berkeley Institute of European Studies, and together with my colleague Joe Patrice from the Worth Institute at the University of Alberta and my colleague Julia Nelson, I would like to welcome all of you to today's event. This is the first of a series of events on innovation and sustainability organized by the Austrian Studies Programs in North America in partnership with the Office of Science and Technology Austria in Washington, DC. Now, before we proceed and start with the introduction of today's speakers, I would like to ask my colleague, Julia Nelson, to say a few more words on the series. So Julia, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Jeroen. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our 2021 series of Transatlantic Conversations on science, technology, and innovation for a sustainable future. This series is a new joint effort to promote research and scientific cooperation across borders in partnership with the Office of Science and Technology Austria and our fellow Austria centers in North America. Sustainability is one of our key shared priorities for this year. And our goal is to bring researchers and experts together in dialogue to share creative approaches to sustainability across different fields, from environmental science to engineering to the arts and humanities. I'll post a link in the chat to check out the full lineup on our website. Before we get started today, I wanted to extend a special thanks to our colleagues at the Office of Science and Technology for helping to put this together. So thank you to Matthew Long, to Ali Bo Nielsen, and to Simona Putcher for their generous support in helping us kick off this series for 2021. So we're excited to welcome today our colleagues at the Worth Institute for Austrian and Central European Studies in Alberta, Canada. Today's session will focus on sustainable cities and on exploring how urban design can support livable, equitable communities. To introduce our panelists, let me now turn it over to the director of the Worth Institute, Joseph Patrice.
Okay, well, hello everybody, and I'm really pleased to be able to participate in this panel discussion. The Worth Institute of Austrian and Central European Studies is happy to participate in the joint programming that we've set up now between the 4 Austrian centers, our partners in Berkeley, New Orleans, and the Twin Cities. I'm also pleased to be able to participate because I'm a Berkeley alumnus, and it's nice to somehow at least virtually be back in Berkeley for a while. And I'm happy to be able to be here also in my capacity as an alum of the University of California's Berkeley campus. Before we begin, or before I begin, I'd like to respectfully acknowledge that the University of Alberta is located on territory delineated by Treaty 6. This treaty was signed in 1876 by representatives of the British Crown and local indigenous nations. These areas are traditional lands of First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and other peoples. The Worth Institute itself was founded back in 1998. It's a privately endowed cultural and research institute based in the Faculty of Arts at the University of Alberta. It's supported and partly funded by the Austrian Ministry of Education, Science, and Research, and has also been recognized by the governments of Croatia, Hungary, Poland, Slovakia, and Slovenia. Our mandate is a national one to raise the profile of Austria and Central European studies across Canada. We work with a network of Austrian centers and partner universities, and again, today's presentation in today's panel is one aspect of that partnership. Now I'd like to introduce to you Xenia Kopf, today's facilitator and the organizer actually of this panel. Ms. Kopf was the Austrian Doctoral Research Fellow in 2019-2020 at the Worth Institute. She's a PhD candidate in the Inter-University Doctoral Studies Program called Science and Art at the University of Salzburg and the Mozarteum University in Salzburg. She holds a master's degree in theater, film, and media studies from the University of Vienna, and the working title of her PhD project is, quote, "The City as a Performative Space, Cultural Practices in Urban Spaces of Transformation." Please join me in welcoming Ms. Kopf will take over, and the floor is now yours. Xenia?
Thank you very much, Joseph, for this nice introduction, and big thanks also from my side to all the partners in setting up today's panel. I'm delighted that we can kick off this series on sustainable futures, this Transatlantic Conversation series, because it's almost needless to say that we live in an urbanized society, in a globally urbanized society, to be more precise. Not only are cities growing, especially in the global south, but we are experiencing the consequences of global urbanization in almost every aspect of our lives, of our economies, of our societies. So if we want to think about sustainable futures, we do have to think about how to make better cities, how to make livable cities, more equitable cities. Sustainability here is not reduced to a single dimension. It cannot be reduced to something like ecology or energy efficiency. It has to include social and cultural aspects of local communities just as well. And what better place to start thinking about this than the field of urban studies, which is a transdisciplinary field for studying urban environments. And it helps us broadening our understanding of cities towards a more holistic perspective that is really in the service of people who live and work in cities all over the world. So let me introduce to you and give a warm welcome to our panelists today. Professor Dr. Sabine Knierbein is the head of the Interdisciplinary Center for Urban Culture and Public Space and Associate Professor for Urban Culture and Public Space at TU Wien, Technical University in Vienna. And she has edited a number of volumes in the past years, but I like to point out the ones that are forthcoming, which is Care in the City, which should be published in 2021, and Urban Space Unsettled Routines, Temporalities, and Contestations should be published in 2022. Her most recent research has focused on Lefebvre's critique of everyday life and lived space and how these concepts fit into contemporary debates in urban studies. So warm welcome to you, Sabine. And our second panelist is Dr. Jim Morrow, who is a research associate at the Worth Institute for Austrian and Central European Studies. So he's basically a colleague of mine. He leads the project on Gemütlichkeit there, and he's also a research professor at Western Colorado University and also research fellow at the Botstiber Institute for Austrian American Studies. And he has published a book entitled Where the Everyday Begins, Environment and Everyday Life, available through Transcript. So I think we have two absolute experts on urban studies here. And I'd like to ask Sabine to kick off now with her input and her recent research on public space and everyday life. The floor is yours, Sabine.
Thank you so much, Xenia, for the warm welcome. I'm just sharing my screen. Just hold on for a second. Going back. So, and I would also like to express my warm thanks to all the organizers, to Julia, Joe, Matt, on behalf of the different partner institutions. And I'm also very thankful to Xenia and also to Jim for having had a lot of preparatory thoughts on this. And I would also like to welcome all colleagues coming from different disciplines and also the students that join us today from TU Wien, but also from other universities. And I think it will be a great session. So my title of my short talk today is actually Critique of Public Space and Everyday Theorizing in the 21st Century. And what I'm trying to do today is first, give you an insight into my perspective. I'm an urban studies professional, and as Xenia mentioned, this is a transdisciplinary and interdisciplinary and sometimes even post-disciplinary field. And the first part then is about public space conjunctures and critique. And from there, I will try to develop my account on everyday theorizing and an intersectional critique of lived space, followed by a short retrospective, which also is, of course, an opening. So in terms of perspective, so the Interdisciplinary Center for Urban Culture and Public Space has been set up sort of 12 years ago as a visiting professorship scheme, financed 9 years by the city of Vienna, and in the last 3 years, actually, by a collaboration between 2 public universities, the city of Vienna, the KTH, Royal Institute of Technology, the Center for Future of Places, and our center. And what is quite important here is that we have been working annually with different themes and visiting professorships. And Xenia mentioned already 2 books that are in the making. But what's important here is, although my talk will be conceptual theoretical, it's based on approximately 50 recent case studies that have been published on transitions of public spaces, let's say in the past 10 to 15 years, followed up by those that are in the making in these 2 books that are like 35 case studies. And so what I did in my habilitation treatise, which is just submitted last year at the Technical University in Vienna, is trying to make sense theoretically and conceptually out of these research over the past years with very different people coming from different disciplines and also geographical backgrounds and cultural backgrounds. And if there is one more general tendency actually to be derived from that, is actually from these very context-specific findings, then this is that, I guess, from most of the case studies, we get this idea that the pressure on everyday life is increasing in very different fields of the globe, in very different cities, and also from different angles, be it economic, socially, culturally, politically, ecologically, and furthermore. And having said that, also there was a further insight that the concept of public space bears certain limitations that are maybe hindering to grasp these transitions and this nature of pressures in everyday life. And second point to add, in that capacity at the Interdisciplinary Center for Urban Culture and Public Space, we bridge public space research and urban cultural research. And I guess the deepest link between the 2 topics or themes is everyday life and also critique of lived space somehow. And so I will first come to the concept of public space, why it's somehow in crisis at the moment. So to give you some insights to all of you from different disciplines, public space is where public life may eventually unfold. So it has been framed like that in urban studies. Some others have considered it also as the geography of the public sphere. So this is a link between also public life and public opinion formation in a more political theory and philosophy kind of sense. But also public space is characterized by performative practices and also the performativity of social action, and not just by rational discourse. So it's very important also to see how we conceive of the social when we talk about public space. And in the wider sense, within the field of urban studies, it's a focal lens also to analyze how patterns of everyday life are changing. And it's also a key ingredient within contemporary spatial planning and urban development practices. And this is very much due also to its overall positive connotations of access, inclusion, integration, cohesion, and at its best, also democracy. But as I said, public space conceptually is in crisis. So Ali Madanipour, with whom I've been working and publishing a couple of years ago, has called for a critical evaluation of the concept of public space, which he says started life as a critique of the neoliberal phase in urban development, but has now widely been adopted by most stakeholders actually operating within that same phase. And this adoption, he says, is at odds with the needs for the provision and maintenance of accessible public spaces. So there's a tension that's growing from that. And as public authorities have embraced a more entrepreneurial approach, the concept and character of public space as a common good have also changed. And this rhetoric of public space as a space of interaction has remained on the one hand, but it has become increasingly an instrument of attraction at the service of unequally distributed economic interests. And in that sense, Colin McFarlane has emphasized that part of the success of entrepreneurial strategies lies in their capacity to capture not just economic trajectories, but highly selective interpretations of the active social. And what I would like to point to by that is that, especially in urban development, that's also what we are analyzing very much in urban studies, is that the active social is redressed in urban development through public space, very much. So this is a key a key concept through which the urban social can be readdressed from different sides, from the scholarly side, but also maybe from the more political side. And potential cracks, just to briefly summarize that before I come to part 2, in the public space debates come from very different angles. On the one hand, there is, as I have already mentioned, a neo-Marxist critique that public space has moved from a critique to an orthodoxy embraced by most stakeholders as an important part of urban development. So this idea of co-optation at the expense of earlier ideals. There is a feminist critique that's quite old and that's echoed again quite vociferously. So this conceptual division into private and public spaces and spheres has been criticized and troubled. And so that's also why we introduced this conception of lived space in order to, for example, not just have a look at public spaces, but connect it to issues of housing, for example, or to issues of mobility, always see things in connection rather than apart. But there also has been a post-political critique, especially in the political sciences. This post-foundational thought has been gaining ground, and this also has been translated to urban studies with Jeffrey Wilson's and Eric Swingedo's work in 2015. And they have, in this debate, has, in terms of political science, rendered public space as an empty space of democracy. And there has been a thesis of the unoccupied city where no identity group, no political group has the potential to occupy just one space. Here the questions emerge if public spaces are indeed specters of radical politics, or if they contain commoning practices per se or not. But especially in political science, again, an Austrian contribution here, Brigitte Bargetz has pointed to the potential for everyday theorizing in political science. And she says that the focus of the post-political debate relating to public space asides of the political, where specters of radical politics gain ground, has been criticized as a one-sided and mainstream reading of political spaces in the city as just focusing on the loud and public spaces and not so much including, for example, the everyday space per se, the household, and the private spaces as political spaces. But also we find innovations in terms of critique of public space from the post-colonial debates. Asef Bayat, with his work Life as Politics, has actually considered public space to be a key theater of contentions. And he says cities where a massive number of inhabitants become compelled by the poverty and dispossession to operate, subsist, socialize, and simply live a life in public spaces, which he calls everyday street politics. He says by empirically framing that, we need to issue a fundamental critique of the Western concept of public space. And he says public space in that sense is a modernist institution to which only a few have institutional access, while shifting also the intellectual focus from public space to lived spaces and ordinary encroachments of people in silent political protest that is sort of fragmented. So I'm sure all of you might know more shortcomings to the public space debates, but so my work was, how can I, on the one hand, deconstruct public space and help to reconstruct it? I'm not about to deconstruct the concept fully, but I needed a second concept in order to fill public space with meaning somehow. And that is why I came up with this idea of everyday theorizing and this work of developing an intersection critique of lived space. And many of you might be aware, or at least for those of you who are not aware of the field of urban studies, this field has been very much characterized by three main books of Henri Lefebvre, which was The Production of Space, then it was The Urban Revolution, and also the Le Droit de la Ville, which is The Right to the City. And all of these books have made it quite prominently discussed over the last 30 years in urban studies. Sometimes with more critically acknowledgement, sometimes with more sort of reconfirmation. But what I thought is that not a lot of scholars, Lefebvrean scholars, address actually Lefebvre's century-long oeuvre, which is the critique of everyday life, which was published actually, as you can see in the next slide, in 3 volumes published in 46, 68, 61, and 81. And in the first book here, which he started to write before the Second World War and finalized after, he analyzed, for example, observations of rising fascism, which is very important, I guess, in nowadays times also to read again. In the second volume of Critique of Everyday Life, he analyzed the sort of urban modernization and the internal colonization of everyday life, especially with saying that in France there was an internal colonialization manifesting in the building of the banlieue, of the French banlieue, which is very interesting in terms of urban development strategies, I think. And then in his last book, he came to the Critique of Everyday Life from Modernity to Modernism, where he also analyzed the advent of paradigmatic shifts between urban production and consumption. And so a society of bureaucratic society of controlled consumption, which has become, I guess, later important for the regulation school as well, the French regulation school. So, but what happened then is that after Lefebvre's death in 91, that interest in his work started to fade in the 80s and 90s. But what we can see, and I will just click it down, as you can see, this list is not comprehensive. We can see a punctual interest in re-theorizing the everyday in very different disciplines. The everyday life reader, that is cultural studies and urban cultural sociology, Ben Highmore, Metro-Marxism, a Marxist tale. Then there is a sort of political philosophy Fuchs book by John Roberts. Then people very much engaged in urban studies have written a book on space difference in everyday life. I mentioned Asef Bayat's work, etc. And only recently, two German-speaking contributions, Ambivalenzen des Alltags, actually produced at the University of Vienna by a colleague, Brigitte Bargetz, and then also Caroline Schur and Anke Strüver. Strüver is also professor for human geography at the University of Graz. So about the rest, Geografien des Alltäglichen, geographies of everyday life. So you see there's a punctual interest, and I've tried to somehow reflect on Lefebvre's critique of everyday life, but also update it through these positions. And there are certain categories for analyzing everyday life. First of all, this uncanny character. There's both Freud, there's passion and lust in everyday life, but also there's trauma. And so there's not just the romantic features in everyday life, but also a lot of traumatic experiences. And I guess we need to read everyday life between these poles. And everyday life is colonization. There are feminist perspectives on space beyond domination and marginalization. There's post-colonial everyday life research, but also this idea of urban resistance through civic disobedience, civil disobedience, and also silent practices. I guess that has not so much been acknowledged in the public space debates because we focus so much on loud protests in public space that we don't so much pay attention to the silent protests. And then also the whole point of how we theorize the social. I guess everyday life research very much invites us to really come to the grains of how we theorize the social also in cities and how we theorize then the urban social somehow. And coming from that, maybe also to the field I was trying to translate from urban studies, because I work at the Faculty of Architecture and Planning, where we, let's say, make social sciences and humanities meet with engineering, with also technological innovations, etc. So I was trying to transfer these insights into concepts that are discussed in planning theory and in architectural theory. And I'm just briefly summarizing and not go into depth, but we can discuss about it later. So I digged out in my habilitation treatise 8 dimensions and an additional 9th dimension. So debates on ordinary cities and ordinary forms of planning, but also debates on relational public spaces and relational spaces. This is theory of space that has been very much influenced also by feminist theorizations of space, which are all discussed but differently in planning, in architecture, and in urban studies. And urban studies serves as a translational field between social sciences and humanities. The embodied dimension, very much owing also to anthropologists like Cesar Lowe at City University in New York. Xenia is very much involved with the performative dimension of lived spaces, but connected to that also affect theories and how affect theorization may help us to come really to grasp meaningful encounters in our everyday lives in cities, the post-political and political dimensions, and what I call the worlded dimensions. Of course, worlded refers on the one hand to post-colonial positions, but also to worlds in other senses, maybe that have been discussed in different theories before. And I would add to that always an open dimension, because what we can't do is really grasp the nature of everyday life completely. It's very important to leave this open dimension, because we everyday life is, I guess, the place to find innovation between the niche, in the niches, between different disciplinary bodies of knowledge. And I have been very much influenced by these writings, and I would like to point to this paper on the rest, because what Caroline Schur and Anke Struver actually have said, that while we promote a plea for the rest in a twofold sense, we issue that we first want to take a break with all conceptual turns of the last 3 decades. Yeah, and secondly, also to dedicate during this break all efforts on emphasizing what has been left out in previous analysis. They say we need to pay more empirical and theoretical attention to everyday life. And my point today, and I'm coming to close right now, was that on the one hand, lived space may serve as an analytical corrective to public space as a concept in current crisis, which allows to engage with deeper intellectual critique by framing space through the lens of everyday theorizing. But public space is in need of urgent recovery somehow, but also might help to unravel potential conceptual pitfalls, shortcomings, and aporia in the conceptions of everyday life and lived space. But maybe to stop with is that lived space and the critical appraisal of lived space on the one hand empirically helps us to analyze the geographies of everyday encounter in cities worldwide, and very context specific from local scholarly views, but also in a philosophical sense could be considered much more as the geography of the human condition. And so I guess everyday life research helps to bridge between very grounded research and very philosophical questions that our unsettled cities in these times are very much in need of. And by this, I would like to close my presentation and thank everyone.
Thank you very much, Sabine. I think the call for more empirical attention to everyday life is a real good connection point to Jim Morrow's work. Since cities are sometimes, or actually not too seldomly, referred to as built environments, I'm very curious to hear what Jim has to tell us, since he's an environmental sociologist by trade, I think, originally. So inviting Jim to take the floor.
Maybe try and get my screen share. Come on, computer. There we go. Yeah, well, I think I am an environmental sociologist. It's always weird. I have to debate and argue. I think technically I'm an environmental ethnographer. I think there's like 5 of us in the world, and most of us are women or people of color. I'm like the only like non-exactly women. The best places I have to start, as always, with the treaty acknowledgement. And at the University of Alberta, we acknowledge that we are situated on Treaty 6 territory, the traditional lands of First Nations and Métis people. And I won't do it in French. Likewise, Western Colorado University acknowledges that we are located on the unceded lands of Ute peoples. So hi, everybody. Grüß Servus. I'm Jim Morrow, and as you already know, I'm from the Worth Institute at the University of Alberta. Also in the previous slide, it's kind of obvious that I'm affiliated with Western Colorado University. Plus, as a bonus, I'm a fellow at the Bochstieber Institute for Austrian American Studies. And what do I do at these places? As Xenia already pointed out, I study the relationship between environment and everyday life. And I mean environment in a very broad sense. I don't just study like beetles, I also study people. So let's just get to it. When you look at urban life, it's really hard to differentiate shopping from being social, or more technically, transactions from relationships. So here's Graz, right? And you don't need me to do a detailed analysis of this image to see that high streets put shopping and consumer culture at the center of everyday life. And if you don't believe me, it's Victor Grün, an Austrian architect who called high streets machines for selling. And who is Grün? If you were raised in the United States or Canada from the 1960s and 1980s, He most likely designed the local mall where you saw Tiffany or Robin Sparkles perform at the food court. And in my case, I was born in Rochester, New York, home to Gruen's Midtown Plaza, which was America's first urban mall. In fact, this mall was responsible for pretty much the decimation of the city center. And as you'll see in this picture, Gruen designed his machine for selling around a narrow public space that conveys people between shops. And interestingly, Gruen insisted that this machine was modeled on Wien's Innenstadt. But when you think of Wien, you don't think of malls and high streets. You think of history and culture and cafes, all of which are social. And I think that designing public spaces to expedite transactions leads to the devaluation of social relationships and public activities. And when transactions are no longer fashionable, because people now shop online or at out-of-town developments, public activity is now in shambles. And I need to make this quite clear. This number isn't me. This comes actually from the Austrian Association of Developers, right? And their recommendation to cities is to pull back the high streets, to pull back this Innenstadt, which is an odd recommendation. Or if I can put my point much more crassly, if we're discounting consumer culture, what culture do we actually have left? And because if you look at the numbers, what remains of our culture is disfigured. As you see, 1 in 3 Austrians feel lonely. And this number gets more grim when you consider reports that people feel no connection with their neighbors. And when you get further into the data, you'll see that loneliness is gendered. More specifically, women are much more likely than men to feel a sense of urban alienation. And even more interesting, it's not the elderly who say that they're lonely. It's actually youth who are loneliest. You know, you would kind of assume that would be older women. It's actually younger women and men. Yet, if the data shows that designing cities around storefronts is antiquated, as well as alienating for people, then why do we still build cities around supporting transactions, right? This picture is from Aspern-Seestadt, Wien's newest, smartest, most sustainable, most innovative Bezirk. And you'll see that urban life is still organized around pavements and storefronts. They had an opportunity to do something different. They still went with the traditional Innenstadt. Right, so to give our cities new life, we have to appreciate that sustainable economies and environmental innovations rely more on social relationships than consumer culture. And I want to give you 3 Austrian examples of how public activity can be enlivened and made more inequitable. And my first example is Geselligkeit, sociability. The word can also mean conviviality, but I actually prefer Hannah Arendt's definition, which is the warmth and fraternity of closely packed human beings. And the obvious place for me to start is actually a Volksfest. And in this video, you'll see the warmth and fraternity of closely packed human beings. And just as a warning, this video is kind of loud. But in the previous video, it didn't only feature people in Tracht singing and drinking. It also had tables and benches. And when Arendt mentions closely packed people, she also notes that tables are sociopetal objects that bring people together. Interesting word, sociopetal. And in this picture, you'll see that tables and benches are stacked to make strangers sit face to face, back to back. And this is a major feature in Volksfest, right? But I'm not just talking about Volksfesten, nor am I all about tables and chairs or patio seating or Schanigarten or beer garden or even third spaces. I'm interested in sociopetal space and how objects bring people together. So in this picture from Salzburg, we again see closely packed tables and people being sociable. And I find it interesting that sociopedal spaces in Austria create a sense of Schaumamoe, right, which is the ability to be relaxed and unhurried in the company of others. So no matter what influencers sell, fire pits and throw blankets and artisanal hot chocolate, they don't make a place cozy. Really, places are gemütlich only when they are shared with others. My second example is Ungezwungenheit, informality. It's an uncommon but significant word. And to explain informality, I'm going to have to start here in New York's Bryant Park, where the city brags that that the city, or actually specifically the park, is programmed within an inch of its life. And that is actually directly from the mayor's office, right? But we have to question why the city schedules and regulates public use. They do this all day long in Bryant Park. Or, yeah. Since many of you are from Berkeley, here's a video from San Francisco's Mission, where programming excludes working class and migrant peoples from public spaces.
Yeah, there is no 7 to 8 anything. If you want to play pickup, you play pickup like the rest of us. It's not pickup, you can book the field. You can book the field. Just because you got money, you can pay for the field. You don't get to book for an hour.
Right, and it's kind of slightly hard to hear, but what the debate was about, or if it was a debate, it was about drop-in soccer and booking the field because the city was using programming to decide who uses the public space. And this is a problem because for working class people and migrant households, they often go to public spaces to escape private problems, right? Or to actually find connection and contact with their community and culture. So when you formalize use, you often exclude people. And yet in Austria, informal use is present in everyday life. In fact, the song that you're about to hear says that informality is a Viennese specialty.
Kennen Sie die Geschichte vom Franz nicht? Also bitteschön, wenn's nicht wissen, wie die geht. Dann erzähl ich gerne Ihnen jetzt von einer Wiener Spezialität. Der Franz hat alle Zeit so viel gefreut und die verbringt gern in der Natur. Da braucht kein Benzin, fährt mit der Tramway hin und ist dort. Dann sagt der Franzl nur, schräge Wiesen am Donaukanal ist meine Riviera auf jeden Fall. Ich brauch keine Miss nicht, kein reichen Papa. Mein Mietern, ja, die mag mich so an.
Right, so for those of you that don't speak German, the song is about a worker, Franz, he's actually a lumberjack, who spends his days on a sloping meadow along the Donau Canal, right? And Franz says that the Donau Canal is the working class Riviera, where people can escape their everyday stresses and be a part of city life. He's even talking about how you can ride the trolley around the city. And Franz's point isn't some sort of old-timey romantic ideal. The Donau Canal is still an informal part of social life in Wien. And again, like Volksfesten and Schönegarten, complex designs and formal programming don't make people social, right? More than anything, communities need an informal space of their own, like a Trägerwiesen, so that they can find an uncurated connection with their community. And I really need to emphasize this idea of it not being curated. And finally, my last example is Selbstbestimmung, which is autonomy. And this is not a word I just made up. It comes from Wien's Women's Office, the Frauenservice, which is dedicated to giving priority to the autonomy and social security of girls and women in the city of Wien. And this is a picture from Wien's Bruno Kreisky Park. And when redesigning the park, planners noticed that a variety of designs for seating changed how people use the space. You know, conventionally in parks, you just put single benches and they face into the park. And one of the new types of seating are these platforms. But what's really unique about these designs is that they were influenced by data showing that 9 in 10 girls stop using public space by the age of 13. This is like painful data actually here. So the new seating prioritizes autonomy, by allowing for multiple uses. And I think this is actually a really great example of what Jane Jacobs called eyes on the street, which was her way of saying that there's a link between vibrancy and community autonomy. Right. And there's one more here, and this is from Langenfeld Garden. It's a guerrilla garden, but what's different is Wien's inclusion of this kind of bigger autonomy in its smart city initiative. In other cities, smart design focuses on private space and treats everything else as a dumb city. Yet in Wien, there is some understanding that public spaces are greener and more vibrant than private spaces. So the city makes space for self-determination by allowing people to care for their own local environment. This is an interesting policy for them to include. And finally, I want to end on a single point. Public places make cities livable. They give people autonomy and a place to escape from the routines of everyday life. And they're places where we find social connection. So when we are building smart cities and trying to innovate, our biggest gains are going to be in local sociopetal spaces where people come together. We can't treat public spaces as a dumb afterthought, right? Otherwise, our lives are going to be reduced just to home and work. And this has already happened. We're retreating to home and work. And in any kind of study, you're going to find that these spaces are grossly inefficient and wasteful. So if we're not building public spaces, we're leaving ourselves to the thinnest of margins to work with. That's where I'll stop for right now. End it officially. Back to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Jim. Thanks to both of you for giving us it's very densely packed input. And I think you showed very, very well how everyday life is so multidimensional that it is hard to grasp, both on a theoretical level and also on an empirical level, actually, as well. But how central it is actually when we think about cities and how to think up futures for cities. But I will directly jump into the Q&A because we already have a couple of questions in the chat, and I hope I can keep track because they keep coming in. So the first point that rang a bell with participants is the gendered use of space, the gendered use of public space, and the gendered experience of urban environments that you mentioned, Jim. So Arlene Oak says maybe women are just more likely than men to say that they're lonely. And Laura Sobral says that women might be overwhelmed or more overwhelmed with caring for the house and others, and that this can translate to loneliness. So I think those are the two comments that came directly on the question of the gendered uses of space. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on that. Maybe Sabine could give a reply to that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so thanks a lot, Xenia. I guess the issue is that's what we're having, especially also at the moment. We're doing research on age and aging, where the topic of loneliness has come up also. And what is interesting is that you don't find the absences in public spaces if you're not explicitly looking for them, especially who's not there. And so for us, a really good recipe was, and that's why we introduced lived space here, was to combine housing studies on gender issues and aging, for example, with public space studies. Because whom you see in public space can give you insights into who's not there. So for example, the elderly that are still mobile, yeah, they actually were pointing to the elderly that are not using public spaces because they're not mobile anymore. And that's why actually you will find them in the homes. Yeah. So the silence and absences both in the homes, but also in public space can be found vice versa. And that's why a lived space approach would help to overcome these gender divisions, both in research, but also in trying to acknowledge the empirical phenomena at stake. But I'm sure Jim has much more to say on that.
Well, it's what Arlene's question was, is actually one of the weirdest things is that data doesn't really deal with like women. So I work oftentimes with a auto company that rhymes with Gaudi. And one of the big bits of data that they are very aware of, but they don't share, is that 2/3 of all commutes by foot or by walking or by bike, sorry, so that's called active transport or active commuting, are done by women. Whereas 2/3 of all auto commutes are done by men, right? And that data is just not hard to find. And it's the same thing that I had with trying to pull the data on loneliness in cities. It's actually, sadly, it's not coming out of Austria, it's coming out of Basel. It's coming out of Switzerland. And Basel is the only city that in Europe outside of like Birmingham, England, that's maintaining this data. I know myself that I was doing some work developing a walkability app. We never even considered taking gender when trying to design the app and the data and figuring out how people use cities differently by like gender. People walk around cities. Had I known that 2/3 of all commutes by foot or bike are by women, it would have changed my view on a lot of this. So it is a problem in the way that we're maintaining and finding this data. There is a gender divide in the data.
Mm-hmm. Well, Arlene has also clarified a little bit that her point was actually more on whether the data is actually showing what we're reading from them, whether, whether the answering, the way that men answer these questions might not even be representative of what they are actually experiencing. Yeah. Well, I'll move on to the next question from Matt Long. He's asking, what does the erosion of the commons mean to our current political moment? If we are concerned about fascism, what does our increased atomization mean? And he's thinking of Hannah Arendt's work on the Greek polis. What are your thoughts on that?
You want to go for that one, Sabine, or?
Maybe you start first and I add up.
So one of the problems in like traditional conceptions of public space, and this again has quite a bit to do with gender, is that we conceive everyday life as heroic or not. And this is one of those mistakes that Hannah Arendt does make in her work, is the assumption that either the routine, the boring, the inside the household, the going down the street to go to the shop, that's not heroic. And you can see this in Heldenplatz, right, in Vienna, right? Major public space, and it celebrates the heroes. And this is one of those problems with understanding everyday life, is that we can't see it through this lens of heroic or not. We have to see it through the kind of quotidian, everyday kind of drudgery, even as grim as it can be. As Sabine opened her talk about, is it can be exciting and it can be drudgery. So that's one of those kinds of problems that we have in understanding it. The other thing is that social life, as Hannah Arendt points out, is it's not just about the individual and the state. Social is another type of relationship that extends through private and public space. And the other thing I need to point out here is that we have been, for the past 60 years at least, since the decimation of a lot of working class neighborhoods, retreating further and further into our private lives. And Arendt, in the end of her life, Life of the Mind, that text, she really focuses on the idea that it's dangerous that we're retreating into our private life and leaving public spaces.
Should I add up?
Yeah, go ahead and follow up.
Briefly?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, thanks, Matt, for that very important question. I guess what we can see, yes, at the moment is a very strong individualization, at least in the Western and Northern urban societies. And this has even been called an urban crisis. And we are at the moment very much trying to dig into what's the relation between the urban crisis and the crisis of democracy. And in that sense, of course, this atomization and the sort of decay of the urban commons plays a key role in understanding, I guess, our book City and Silence was about these new authoritarianisms, and how that links to, public space coming in crisis as well somehow. And of course, this was before the pandemic, so the pandemic even rendered that more stressful somehow. But I don't want to get too dystopian either, because at the same time, it has been always confirmed from a lot of empirical findings that everyday life and lived space is always the place of revolt, resistance, revolution, and also redemocratization. And that's why I guess it's very important to understand the link between what Jim called the social and the political. Yeah, so political opinion formation has a lot to do with how the social is formed. And if the social is very much under pressure because we have entrepreneurial cities that render subjects now as individual entrepreneurial subjects, that is very, very, very much adding onto the pressure we already have, I guess. So I guess all this turn towards entrepreneurial cities has very much contributed to that atomization, but also, of course, forms of consumerism, etc. So what we need to do is, and maybe the care debate is one debate to do so, to talk and bring in new debates in urban development and in democracies where solidarity and care and like positive values of being in common are once again heralded.
Well, I think the notion of individualization, atomization might also actually link up to the next issue I will address here. So we have like 8 minutes left now. We won't be able to address all the questions that have come in, but 2 have come in on the current pandemic times, of course. And as you have already pointed out, Sabine, public spaces and the uses of public spaces and how the current political developments are playing out in the use of public space is actually again linked up to the pandemic time as well, because we're experiencing demonstration and protests against COVID regulations on a regular basis, also in Vienna, for example, and they are very much pointing to the fact that they're defending their individual liberties against mass regulations that they protest against. So we have 2 comments here. How do you see, one is from Julia Nelson, how do you see everyday experience and social interactions changing in cities during or after COVID with restrictions on public spaces? How can cities create spaces for people to gather while encouraging sociability and informal interactions? That is one question. And then I'd like to add the other one right away. On Julia's point by William Tuinstra. This was also on my mind all the time while seeing those pictures of people together and all these Geselligkeit. So what happens to these things in COVID times? I think probably that will be our last point because we have 5 minutes.
Jim, you want to go ahead?
Sure, I'll go real quick. So I want to start real quickly. In 1856, the city of London had a cholera outbreak. Besides cleaning water, they realized that they needed to build public parks. That if they created public parks, they could actually defend space within the city and control disease that was making the city cleaner by being greener. Similar policies have been instituted in Sri Lanka, that they bring the city in the distance that a mosquito can fly. They create like a system of measurement that way. During COVID, obviously, the things that make us come together are our biggest problem, right? And so sociability is the vector. That said, there's never been a greater need for public spaces than in the past year, right? You know, private space is where we are, but we want to go outside, we want to exercise. You know, last year when Austria was shutting down lockdowns, one of the biggest things was people still need to go outside to exercise. They still need that place to release. And so it feels like, yeah, we need space to be sociable, but we really have never needed the space as much as we have in the past year. I'll pass that one off to Sabine, set you up. I don't know.
Okay, I mean, the corona pandemic has actually brought us to an encapsulated everyday life. So everything is like torn inwards and torn into our home. And so if the home was the nexus, the last enclave of of everyday life to be protected. Now it's not protected anymore. So it's put up with maximum pressure. And this affects, on the one hand, what we call social reproduction, how we will change in the future in our societies. But I guess also, I mean, Jim, you pointed to that, the need for public space has, I guess, for many people become very much evident. And what happens right now is, I guess, that this experiencing of difference in the city is not that much given anymore. You might find it in those public spaces that are actually that people claim once again, So we stay in our smaller cohorts because the community ties are with those we already have ties with somehow to organize. But at the same time, what I see is appropriation of people that just appropriate benches, appropriate public spaces. And I don't want to romanticize, let's say, anti-corona pandemic regulation demonstrations, etc. But at the same time, the first views during the pandemic we got from people protesting against the government in Israel, I guess it was in Tel Aviv or Jerusalem, I'm not so sure. But they were standing actually with a security distance of 1.50 meters or something. So protest is a fundamental political right to be exerted in a public space. And people might find their ways of dealing with these pandemic restrictions and still protesting. And so I guess it's very important, and we discussed it very much with the students, if people should protest or not. But what I see with the younger generations, that they are not so much aware of what we have achieved through protests in our history, in the emancipatory history of cities. Not just talking about the Black Lives Matter movement now, but also civil rights movement in the past, but also feminist movements, environmental movements, etc. So I guess protest is a very important form of political expression in public space. And so we should keep that definitely. But of course, we need to be careful about the pandemics, because the anti-corona demonstrations are also the hubs of infections. So there's a lot of contradiction we have to deal with. But I guess we need, and that's the hopeful spark, I guess, you see that people, they need public space. It's not just sufficient to stay in your own place, especially if you only have a small flat, etc. And you don't have the house in the countryside where you can spend your weekends. So they need public spaces, and they don't only need public spaces for, let's say, for being outside and getting fresh air. That's important. But they need it because we need to be social. We need to get exchange with someone, and we need also to be surprised by the spontaneity that happens in public spaces, these intuitive moments, etc. All our intuition is because we are surprised in public spaces. So that's a very important part of urban life and urban learning. And there was just one last comment on the technology issues and virtual public spaces. And I think the public space researchers have been dealing with that since a long time. And you will find very nice examples of how virtual conceptions help public spaces like flash mobs, etc., get social and get political again. But there is also some footage now on Pokemon Go studies and how entrepreneurial strategies of games change the whole behavior of youth in public spaces. There's a case study in Munich, for example. So I guess there's a whole range of findings you can have between the virtual and the sort of more face-to-face dimensions of public spaces. And we are normatively in very different directions also.
Thank you very much. I just got a message from Julia. She told me we can go for a few extra minutes to allow 1 or 2 more audience questions. I don't even know where to start. Maybe connecting up to what Sabine just said about how we need public spaces to be social. Somebody has noted the poster in my background saying that young people play games in houses is a major social event. So what about more game options outdoors, not just sports? Tracy Friedman sent in that comment. But I am thinking, when I am looking at this poster, I'm thinking more about publics on different levels. I'm thinking about macro publics, meso publics, and micro publics, and how micro publics might just be happening in so-called private spaces. So that might be one thing to think about. But I will give you maybe 2 more comments, and you can decide which one you'd like to address in the last few minutes. So Alec Dara Abrams sent in a question or a comment. A critical aspect of the American shopping mall is its connection to the transportation system, the acres and acres of surrounding parking lots. How much does in-between activity interact with the perceived quote unquote main activities of socialization or even transaction? So this has to do with the question of land, which is a huge field. How land is something that's contested and commodified and being used up for monofunctional spaces. That would be one thing. Then there is a question about Brazil, Curitiba, Brazil's people-friendly urban design spaces. Maybe Sabine knows something about this. I am not aware of it. And let me see, I think that was it. Oh yeah, we have one more question about how by Avi Rosenzweig, how improvisation is easier within a clearly followed structure with broad agreement about frameworks. So this is a comment on curating and uncurated spaces. And I'd like to just leave it up to you now, which of these comments and questions you'd like to address in the last couple minutes we have.
I can start with the last one. Jim, what do you think?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, I guess programming functional uses for public spaces has been very much part, maybe before entrepreneurial strategies and urban policies, but also it is a key part of entrepreneurial strategies. And I can just give you the example from Thessaloniki, where colleagues of me have been doing extensive year-long case studies, where actually there were protest groups with this sort of protest movements in Greece, young unemployed people, especially protesting at the waterfront. And then there came the Resilient Cities initiative, and redressed and redesigned was part of the redesign of the urban waterfront. And now these publics are not sort of displayed, and they're taken away, they are displaced from the waterfront because they were too critical and they were not so much paying a role in consumption patterns at this new waterfront. And they are replaced by other types of publics that are both socioeconomically more well off, but also less critical. And so in that sense, programming is also a tool for, I don't know if we would call it social engineering, but at least for rendering, like I cited Colin McFarlane in that, rendering differently the active social. Yeah, and having an idea which subject should be there in public space. And I think these strategies are actually very dangerous, because publics is an open term and should be inclusive all the time. And there should not be a division, for example, what is very much done in planning into target groups, yeah? Because a public is something that per se needs to refresh itself in being inclusive. It must not exclude anyone. Although, of course, when you come to different public spaces, you will always find patterns of social inclusion. But in the ideal type sense, we need to keep that term open. And I think in a lot of efforts to program, there is a tendency, sometimes a bias, sometimes not wanted or even not realized, but very often very much chosen to render certain target groups as more relevant for public spaces than others. And I think this is highly problematic. And this actually goes against the truly political character of public space as well.
I was thinking about the question about play, and that relates to the girls leaving public spaces. And the Frauenservice, it's probably 15 years ago, the recommendation was to not put up basketball courts, but to put up volleyball courts. And so in Jesuitenwiese, you see volleyball, you bring your own net. And you see the increasing popularity of other types of games. And Frauenservice, in all their work to do gender mainstreaming, it's one of the weird places that they really focused, was trying to open up public spaces to girls. And so it was kind of an interesting observation, because in Vienna, there's some interesting places for like basketball courts. And when I was designing my talk, I wanted to share like basketball courts are a place for informal play. But all the pictures were just dudes. It was just Junge. And yeah, there were multicultural spaces. Yet when I found, I found pictures of volleyball being played in Graz, it was, you would see small girls watching the sport being played. And so it's one of those things that we have to be aware of, like what games we're choosing or what sports we're choosing, and that kind of odd mainstreaming of public spaces does actually determine the use of it. It's one of those things that when I've thought about activating spaces, it's one of those things that really rarely comes to mind, but I have to be more aware of that. Anything else you want to answer or ask?
I think this is a nice point to end on. I think that your presentations, your inputs, and also this discussion has very nicely pointed out how much in need of an intersectional perspective we are on lived spaces, on cities as lived spaces, and how important it is to include everyday lives in our research, also in our empirical work on cities and urban environments. And I would love to keep this conversation going. I'm not sure if we were able to address all the questions. Thank you very much for sticking around for a little longer than planned. And please be in touch if there is anything that we have not been able to discuss now. I'm not sure if the host will jump in to say final word. Yes.
Thank you, Xenia. Thank you so much, Jim and Sabine, for your great presentations. Your really insightful and interesting research. Thanks to Joe for introducing our event today, and thanks everyone in the audience for your engaged questions. We really look forward to seeing you at our next event on April 29th, which will be on sustainability in the Alps and renewable energy. So please sign up. We hope to see you then and in the future for more IES and Austrian studies related programs. So thank you so much. Have a great rest of your day.